So this is part 2 to my talk about game art style, art direction in games. If you haven't seen part 1, go back, check it out. Or maybe you're just skipping ahead to the part about how to get started making art. So I was just talking about the style triangle, and it'll put up some fences and make sure you're playing in the right ballpark, but art is specific. Artists need to make specific choices. And to get started making specific, stylish game art, a wonderful place to start is inspiration. Reference points. And since we've learned that games have a relatively short history of style, and for a lot of that time it's been heavily technically constrained, it's a great idea to broaden your search for inspiration and look at other media. Now I'm going to tell you how to be inspired. That's going to be up to you to find what you think is beautiful. And as artists, we sort of do this naturally. But instead, I want to talk about what you can't borrow from other media. And hopefully by understanding that, you'll find interesting new ideas that are a great fit for games. Of course, this is all my opinion, my take on this. So let's start with film and photography. When we look at a film as a source of inspiration, I think it's most important to pay attention to the cinematography. If you look at the roles of people on a film, the director, for example, that's the player. The actors, they're either going to be other players, and so they're going to look dumb, or they're going to be AI, and they're going to look dumb. They're never going to approach the performance level in gameplay of Hollywood movie. But the photographic look of a film, as developed by the director of photography, is fantastic reference. But you can't copy the photographic look of a film wholesale. With film, once you've got a good lens on your camera, you set your exposure, you've lit the set, you get a massive amount of stuff for free that graphics programmers in games have to try and painstakingly recreate. Game engines have to make this all up from scratch and render it 30 times a second, at least. For example, in the last generation, a lot of art directors wanted the look of Saving Private Ryan, which was a bleach bypass technique, and a lot of programmers spent a lot of time recreating that look. Not sure why that's half transparent. Hopefully it shows up okay in the capture. But with a film, all you had to do is bypass the bleach. And the same thing goes for atmospheric perspective, bloom, ambient occlusion, bounce lighting, dynamic vegetation, on and on and on. Generally speaking, the whole beautiful complexity of nature, cameras get that for free, and games have to work to replicate it in painstaking simulated detail. Same goes for set design and costume design. There's great work in film to be referenced, but that natural complexity of real materials and locations is basically impossible to replicate in perfect detail in a game. So keep that in mind the next time you hear game artists say they want their game to look like, say, Kingdom of Heaven. Unless that game artist has infinite programmers and infinite time, they're not gonna get it all. They're gonna have to make some hard choices, and by making those choices, they're defining a style. If we look at 3D animation, there's a ton of beautiful 3D animation work out there, and a lot of it uses manufactured 3D worlds, just like games. People have to build this stuff from scratch. The artists and the technical folks on these films are doing what game programmers and artists are doing, coming up with tricks and hacks to expressively reflect the beauty of the real world. But games can't do everything 3D animation can. Usually when there's a beautiful new effect in a film. It's based on new technology that takes hours to render a single frame. But there's all these techniques: fur and hair, subsurface scattering, advanced lighting, and compositing. Games are always going to be cheapening these effects or waiting until the hardware catches up. There are some victories. We've got subsurface scattering on Jack's ear on the left and subsurface scattering in The Last of Us. Our version's a little less powerful, but we have ways of working around it. Illustration is perhaps the richest vein of inspiration to explore. There's so much beautiful work and so much stylistic variety to be found. But you've got to look with a critical eye. This is a beautiful painting by Tom Scholes, one of my favorite artists. But if you were to look at this and try and build a game around it, what you're getting from this is tone. It's a feeling, some shape language, but not much beyond that. You can't build a game environment to look like this. So much of illustration is about composition, using compositional tricks to draw your eye around the image, liberally spicing with atmospheric perspective, softening edges wherever you need to, hardening them in other places, removing detail where it's not needed. Things you can't do really on the fly in a dynamic environment where the player is holding the camera and the player is determining the composition. So if you take an illustrator as inspiration, you sure wouldn't know what elements you can actually put into a game. Here we have shadows, black shadows, hiding things for the sake of composition. If you put this stuff in a game under game lights, give the camera to the player, the magic of that illustration might be completely lost. Valve understood this when they did the, oh, we missed something here. There's a presentation out there about the art direction for Team Fortress 2 and how they referenced J.C. Leyendecker and other illustrators and adapted that look to their games. They took what worked and they developed their own look around it, and that's what you have to do. It's worth mentioning that 2D games, because you've got this big background canvas to work with, can do a lot more. The camera is not fixed, but it's a lot more fixed than it is in 3D games. And you know, take the opportunity in a 2D game to paint a beautiful canvas. Drawn animation is sort of illustration in motion, and it has a lot of the disadvantages I just described from illustration. And even worse, the game version of drawn animation often lacks that illusion of life that comes from the animator's hand. Just today, somebody mentioned in a YouTube video how he was inspired by John Kay, the guy behind Ren and Stimpy. And John Kay had said, "I never draw a face the same way twice." And that was sort of how he got power of expression through his hand into those characters. Of course, that's the opposite of what we do in video games. The other thing is, in a game, the animator's hand has to be subject to the player's hand on the controller. I had a video here, it must be gone, I must have to link to it. You've got a punch animation, there's not going to be any anticipation on that punch. It's got to hit right after the player presses the button. And outlining characters and environments can be problematic too. There are specific games like Mark of the Ninja where drawn animation works, but usually it's because the whole game is really designed around evoking that style of hand animation. In order to create great art for a video game, you've got to understand what's going to look good in the game engine, what's going to look good in the hands of the player. That's the trick. Nothing from these other media will look good in a game if you borrow the style wholesale. Instead, look at this stuff, and do look at it, but look at it through the lenses of game art. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next part, so I hope to see you there.